The smoke was still rising when Constance Ray arrived. She had not expected to find the bridge gone. She had not expected to find anything at all at Asherton Park, save a letter of dismissal and the silence of a household already deciding she had never quite belonged. What she found instead was a man standing at the river's edge in the gray November morning, his dark coat spattered at the hem, his hands bearing the unmistakable stain of tar and ash, and behind him the charred remnants of a crossing that had served the estate since before anyone living could remember. The stone pier still stood on either bank. Between them, the oak planking lay in the water, black and still, sending thin ribbons of smoke into the mist. She stopped the hired cart at the top of the lane. The carter beside her said nothing. Neither did she. The Earl of Asherton did not turn. He would have heard the wheels on the frozen track. He heard everything. She had learned that in the 3 months of her employment here, learned it the way one learns the particular dangers of a house by surviving them once, and then again, and then a third time. He noticed small disturbances. He registered arrivals. He chose, with great deliberateness, what he responded to and what he allowed to pass without acknowledgement, and in that choosing there was a power the household felt in every room, even the rooms he never entered. He had not entered the schoolroom once in 3 months. He had sent written instructions. He had sent once the estate solicitor, a small dry man named Mr. Fitch, to inquire whether the young Viscount was making suitable progress in French. He had not come himself. She had been hired, in the language Mr. Fitch had used, as a temporary arrangement. The Viscount's regular governess had taken ill. Constance had been available, had been recommended by a clergyman's widow in Salisbury who knew her father's family, and had arrived at Asherton Park on a Wednesday morning in August, carrying a small trunk and the quiet certainty that she would not be staying long. She had the look of someone passing through, or so the housekeeper, Mrs. Drummond, had told the kitchen maid the first week. Not unkindly, simply observationally. She had the look of a woman the house would not keep. That had been the first time the words were used in her hearing. She did not know what it meant, precisely, except that Mrs. Drummond had looked at her plain gray dress and her unpretentious manner and her small trunk and had made a calculation. And the calculation had come out to a single word. Temporary. Interchangeable. One of the passing women who moved through great houses without disturbing the air. She had arrived as a governess and nothing more. That was what the house decided. And the house was, in its way, a more reliable judge of social reality than any individual it contained. The carter cleared his throat. She descended from the cart, paid him, and walked down the lane toward the river. The November grass was stiff with frost. The Earl had not moved. He was perhaps 40 feet from the bank now, standing with the posture of a man surveying something he has made. And she noticed as she drew closer that his expression was not distressed. It was quiet, controlled. The same expression he wore, she imagined, for most of what the world showed him. "Miss Ray," he said without turning. His name was Edmund Croft, Earl of Asherton, and he was 35 years old, and no one in the county thought well of what he was known to have done 4 years ago. That was the other thing about arriving in a house like this one. You learned the shape of the history before anyone told you the content. You learned it from the portraits that had been moved, the drawing room that was locked, the piano that was never opened, the name that the staff did not use. You learned it from the quality of the silence around certain subjects. And then, eventually, if you stayed long enough, someone told you. She had stayed long enough. She stopped a few feet behind him. The river moved past the blackened remnants of the bridge with a sound that seemed too ordinary for the occasion. "Your letter came this morning," she said. It was not a letter of dismissal. He turned then and she saw the ash more clearly on his coat, and she saw that his face bore the controlled exhaustion of a man who had been awake for most of the night. It was a letter of warning. She wanted to ask him what the bridge had done to deserve this. She did not, because she was a governess and nothing more, and because she suspected, in the way she had learned to suspect things at Asherton Park, that she already knew. The warning in his letter had been about his brother. Constance Ray had come to Asherton Park in August, carrying very little except her father's recommendation, a working knowledge of French and Italian, a talent for arithmetic that women of her station were not generally supposed to possess, and the particular resilience of someone who had been managing on insufficient means for long enough that it no longer registered as hardship. She was 23 years old. She was not, by the season's accounting, anything at all. She had not debuted. She had not had a season. She had been, for the last 3 years, the daughter of a dead clergyman with modest savings, a small house in Wiltshire that the entail would pass to a cousin, and a set of accomplishments that were useful in schoolrooms and invisible in ballrooms. She was, as Mrs. Drummond had observed, passing through. What Constance had not expected was the child. His name was Oliver, and he was 9 years old, and he had his father's eyes without his father's containment. Where the Earl's eyes were steady and held still, Oliver's moved constantly, fixing on things, and releasing them with the rapid attentiveness of a mind that had not yet learned to manage its own curiosity. He asked questions the way some children breathed, steadily and without self-consciousness, and the questions were not always the ones she expected. He had asked her, in the second week, why the decimal system was preferred to other counting systems. He had asked her, in the third week, whether she thought people who had died could still be in a place, not in a religious sense, but in some other sense that he had not found the words for yet. She had considered that question for a long time before answering, because it was the kind of question that deserved a real answer, and she had told him that she thought the people we loved best continued to occupy the spaces they had lived in, not as ghosts, but as a quality of attention, the way a room where someone read every morning for 20 years still holds something of that habit in its light. He had sat with this for a moment. Then he had said that he thought that was probably right. He was the reason she had stayed past the first 6 weeks when the original governess recovered, and there was, by strict accounting, no longer any reason to keep her. Oliver had a governess again. Oliver did not need Constance, and yet Oliver had. With the quiet determination of a child who has learned to hold on to the things he wants without quite asking for them, made it clear that he wanted her to stay. The Earl had said nothing about it. He had simply not dismissed her. She had understood this to be a form of permission, or possibly indifference, and had found that she could not, when it came to the moment of packing the small trunk, bring herself to leave a child who had told her, in the careful, measured language of a boy already learning to contain himself, that she was the first person at Asherton Park who had explained to him why the equations worked, rather than simply requiring him to repeat them. She had stayed. This was the decision that mattered, though she could not have told you so at the time. Most decisions that matter do not announce themselves. They arrive wearing the clothes of smaller choices, of staying 1 more week, of teaching 1 more lesson, of sitting with a child in the library through a thunderstorm because he was frightened, and she was there. She had been there. She had stayed. And now it was November, and the bridge was gone. And the Earl of Asherton was looking at her with the expression of a man who had not intended to be seen, and was not, precisely, displeased that he had been. "Your brother," she said. "He will come through the village now." He turned back to the river. "He will have to ask permission at every threshold. He will not be able to arrive unannounced. He is not fond of being observed. She thought about this. She thought about what she knew of the Earl's brother, which was what the kitchen maid had told her in September, which was what the kitchen maid had heard from the head groom, which was what the head groom had been carrying around like a stone in his pocket since before she had arrived. There had been, 4 years ago, an arrangement involving a bridge, an estate, and a woman who had died. The arrangement had involved the Earl's brother, whose name was Mr. Reginald Croft, and whose particular skill was knowing which doors were unlocked. The drawing room was unlocked in those days. The piano was opened. The Earl had been, by all accounts, a different man. She had not asked about the portrait. She had noticed it missing from the gallery wall, the pale rectangle where the paint was slightly brighter, the hook still in the plaster. She had not asked. "Miss Ray," the Earl said again, still looking at the river. "I should tell you that Reginald is coming because of Oliver." The cold of the morning settled into her more completely. She understood then the particular nature of the warning. She understood it in her hands first. The way one understands cold, as a physical fact before it becomes a thought. Reginald Croft was Oliver's uncle. Reginald Croft was the kind of man, she now perceived, who understood legal relationship as a form of currency. And Oliver was 9 years old, and the Viscount, and the Earl's heir, and the Earl was unmarried, and the estate was one of the older entailed properties in the county. And an unmarried Earl with no wife and one fragile child was, to a certain kind of brother, an opportunity dressed in the clothing of concern. "He claims I am not well," the Earl said. "He has said so to the solicitors. He has said so to 2 magistrates of his acquaintance." He paused. "He has said so to the lady he hopes to see installed as Oliver's guardian." There it was. He had burned the bridge so his brother could not arrive in the night. She did not say either of these things. She said, "What is it you need from me?" He turned, and she saw something she had not seen in 3 months of watching him carefully, a moment of genuine uncertainty. It lasted less than a second. It was followed immediately by the return of the controlled quiet that was his ordinary expression, and if she had not been watching for it, she would have missed it entirely. "I need you to testify," he said, "to Oliver's state of mind and progress. I need you to speak to Mr. Fitch, and to say what you have observed. You are, at present, the most credible witness to what occurs in this house, because you have no interest in the outcome." He believed this. He did not know yet that it was not quite true. She said, "I will speak to Mr. Fitch." If you have ever watched someone make a decision that costs them something, you know the quality of the pause that followed. If you have not, I invite you to stay a little longer. He nodded once. He looked back at the river. After a moment he said, without inflection, "You should go inside. The frost will not lift before noon." She went inside. The testimony to Mr. Fitch occupied 2 hours on a Friday afternoon in the library, which was the room Constance had come to understand best in the house, its floor-to-ceiling shelves and worn leather chairs, and the quality of afternoon light through the tall windows that made it feel like a place where honesty was marginally less expensive than elsewhere. She spoke about Oliver's progress in French and mathematics and Latin. She spoke about his aptitude for questions, his habit of working through a problem by speaking it aloud, his tendency to check her emotional state before asking for help, as if he were not entirely certain the help would be offered. She spoke, at some length, about the morning in October, when he had brought her a set of equations he had worked out independently, checking the grammar of the number system in the same methodical way she had once watched his father check the accounts of a drainage ditch. The method was his father's. The curiosity was his own. Together, they constituted, she said, a child who was not isolated, but engaged, who was not neglected but attended, whose world was small by the season's accounting, but rich in the specific way that worlds become rich when someone takes them seriously. She did not speak about the corridor, or the door frame, or the expression on the Earl's face in the October light. That was not evidence. That was something else, and she knew the difference. She spoke about these things in plain terms, and Mr. Fitch recorded them in a small notebook, and when she had finished, he looked up and said, in his dry, precise voice, that she had provided a more complete picture of the Viscount's character and welfare than he had received from any source in the preceding 4 years. "It will be considerably useful," he said. "I am glad," she said. He said after a pause, "Miss Ray, I wonder if you are aware of the full nature of Mr. Reginald Croft's claim." She said that she was not. He told her. It took some time. The claim involved a document Reginald had caused to be drawn up 18 months prior, citing the Earl's alleged instability, his alleged neglect of the estate, and his alleged isolation of the young Viscount from appropriate society. It cited a physician in Bath who had spoken with Reginald privately for 20 minutes and had produced, on the basis of that conversation, an assessment of the Earl's mental faculties that Mr. Fitch described as legally dubious and personally offensive to anyone who had spent more than an afternoon in the Earl's company. It cited, she understood from Mr. Fitch's careful phrasing, the general opinion of several influential families in the county who did not know the Earl and had therefore formed their view of him from the only sources available to them, which were his brother and the silence the Earl himself maintained. "There is a hearing," Mr. Fitch said. "In 3 weeks' time. In London." She thought of the burned bridge. She thought of the Earl standing in the frost with tar and ash on his hands, facing the river in the gray morning light. He could not defend himself because he did not speak. He has never spoken. He has burned bridges and locked drawing rooms and turned portraits to the wall, and the world has looked at the evidence of his pain and decided it was evidence of instability, because the world does not distinguish between grief and madness when both produce silence. "What does he need?" she said, "to win?" Mr. Fitch looked at her for a moment over the edge of his notebook. "Character witnesses," he said. "People who can speak to his daily conduct, his care for his son, his management of the estate. People the court will believe." She said, "I am a governess." "You are, Mr." Fitch agreed. "Which is why your testimony will be believed above that of almost anyone else. You have no social motive to protect him. You have no financial interest in the outcome. You are, in the eyes of the court, precisely the kind of woman who has no reason to lie on his behalf." She sat with this for a moment. She sat with the full weight of what she had told herself for 3 months, which was that she was passing through, that the house would not keep her, that the small trunk was ready to be packed, and the hired cart was always available, and she had no interest in the outcome. She had, she acknowledged to herself, a very considerable interest in the outcome. She had, she acknowledged to herself, been watching the Earl of Asherton for 3 months with the attention of someone who is trying to understand something important, and what she had come to understand. He was not unstable. He was not neglectful. He was a man who had loved someone and lost her in a way that was not his fault, and that he had decided, on the evidence available to him at the time of the decision, was entirely his fault, and he had been carrying that decision inside him ever since, with the same careful discipline he brought to everything else, and the carrying of it had made him look, to anyone who did not understand the weight, like a man who felt nothing. He felt everything. She had known this since October. since the morning she had found him in the corridor outside the schoolroom, standing at the door with one hand pressed flat against the frame, listening to Oliver recite a passage from a history of ancient Rome with the particular concentrated expression of a man hearing something he is afraid he will not hear again. He had not known she was watching. She had been carrying a book to the morning room, and she had stopped in the corridor, and she had seen his hand on the doorframe, and his face turned toward his son's voice. And the expression on his face in that moment had been the clearest thing she had seen in 3 months. It was not longing, exactly, though there was longing in it. It was not grief, though grief was part of its composition. It was the expression of a man who has learned that what he loves most can be taken without warning, and who stands at a distance from it now because the distance is the only protection he has been able to devise, and who hates the distance but maintains it anyway because the alternative, which is nearness, carries a risk he has not yet found the courage to accept. She had seen that expression before. She had seen it in the face of her father in the last year of his life, when he looked at her across the dinner table in the small house in Wiltshire, and knew what was coming, and could not say it, and could not look away. He had heard her then. His hand had come away from the frame. He had turned, and the expression had resolved into the controlled quiet, and he had looked at her for a moment with the particular steadiness of a man who is deciding what to do about having been seen. And then he had nodded once and walked away. She had stood in the corridor for a moment longer. The schoolroom door was still open. Oliver's voice continued, reading aloud, unaware of anything. She listened to it. And then she listened to the Earl's footsteps receding down the hall. Measured and even, controlled as everything else about him was controlled. And she thought about the distance between what a man shows and what a man holds, and how sometimes the holding of a thing is the truest measure of its importance. Then she had gone to the morning room and put down her book and sat very still for a while, understanding something she had not permitted herself to understand until that moment. The night before the hearing, she could not sleep. She lay in the small governess's room on the 3rd floor and listened to the house settle in the cold, the wind off the park moving through the eaves. And she thought about what she would say in London, and whether what she would say would be sufficient, and whether sufficiency was the right measure for what she was attempting to do. She rose before dawn. She went downstairs in the dark house, following the habit of 3 months, to the library where the fire was banked, but could be brought up quickly. She did not expect to find anyone there. He was there, sitting in the wing chair to the left of the fireplace, not reading, not writing, simply sitting with the posture of a man who has been sitting in the same chair for several hours and has not found the sitting productive, but has not been able to move. There was a glass on the table beside him, untouched. There was a folded letter in his right hand, worn at the creases in the way of a letter that has been read many times, and folded and unfolded until the paper has gone soft. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. He did not ask what she was doing there. She did not explain. She went to the fireplace and added fuel and brought up the banked coals without speaking, because this was a task that needed doing, and doing it was something she could give to the moment that did not require either of them to say anything yet. The fire caught. The room came up to a warmer register. She drew the other wing chair a reasonable distance from his and sat down. After a long moment, he said, "She would have liked you." She understood that he was speaking of his wife. She understood also that this was the first time in 3 months he had spoken of her to anyone in the house, and that the offering of it was something she needed to receive carefully. She said, "Tell me about her." He looked at the fire. He was quiet for long enough that she thought perhaps he had decided not to speak after all. And then he spoke. And what he said was not what she had expected. It was not grief or guilt, or the smooth, polished surface of a man relating a fact he has rehearsed to the point of painlessness. It was the specific, unordered account of someone remembering a person rather than a loss. Her name had been Margaret. She had argued with him about the bridge. She had said it was badly situated and prone to flooding, and he had said the bridge had stood since his grandfather's time, and she had said that was an argument for its antiquity, not its usefulness. She had been right. It had flooded in the spring of 1809, and he had repaired it, and she had said nothing, which was her way of being generous with a victory. She had died in November of 1810. A fever, quick and complete. Oliver had been 5 years old. "I did not burn the bridge because of Margaret," he said. "I burned it because Reginald has been using it to come at night. For 2 years. The servants do not tell me because they are afraid of him. He comes at night, and he walks through the house, and he speaks to Oliver in terms that a child does not know how to reject. And last month Oliver asked me whether I was going to die." The fire spoke for a moment. Then there was silence again. She said carefully, "What did you tell him?" "I told him everyone dies." He paused. "I told him I did not intend to do it soon." He had told a 9-year-old boy something true and insufficient and correct. And the gap between what was true and what he needed was the whole width of what you lost and cannot recover. And I see it. And I think you know I see it. She said, "He will be all right in London." "He is not coming to London." "I know, I meant when it is over." She looked at the letter in his hand. "Will you tell me what that says?" He looked down at the folded paper. He turned it once in his hands. The old familiar motion of a man who has been returning to the same thing for 4 years, finding in it each time something slightly different from the last visit. "It is from Margaret," he said. "Written 3 days before she died. I did not receive it in time." He was quiet. "She says she is not afraid. She says Oliver will be more than either of us have imagined. She says—" He stopped. He looked at the fire. "She says I will need someone to argue with about the bridge." The silence after this had a quality she could not have named precisely. It was not comfortable, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something having been said that was now living in the air between them, neither of them quite sure yet what it would become. She became aware of her own hands, folded in her lap. She became aware of the distance between their chairs, which was proper and measured, and would remain so, and of the fact that the distance itself had become, somehow, the most charged thing in the room. She said, "I think she was right about the bridge." He turned from the fire and looked at her. The firelight was on his face. She had seen him in all the lights this house offered. The flat gray morning light, the cold winter afternoon, candlelight at the head of the dinner table she never sat at, the November frost light on the riverbank. She had not seen him in firelight, close, at 3 a.m, with the letter of his dead wife in his hand, and the look of a man who has been carrying something alone for 4 years and has just set it down, experimentally, to see whether the floor will hold. The floor, she thought, was holding. "Miss Ray," he said. "Constance," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had first seen in the corridor outside the schoolroom and had been trying not to name ever since. "Constance," he said. She did not move. She did not need to. Everything that needed to be said in that moment was said in the careful, deliberate quality of his voice around her name, the way he had held it before speaking, the way he spoke it now as if it were something he had been carrying in his pocket for a long time and was only now willing to take out and look at. She said, "We should sleep before London." "Yes," he said. He did not look as though sleeping was something he would manage. "I believe we should." They did not sleep before London. They sat by the fire until the house began to lighten with dawn, not speaking much, not needing to, and the quality of the silence shifted over those hours from the charged, uncertain thing it had been to something quieter and more certain, the kind of quiet that settles after a decision has been made, even though neither party has yet spoken the decision aloud. The hearing in London occupied one day. She is not interested here in the legal proceedings except to say that they were what they needed to be. Mr. Fitch had prepared carefully. The physician from Bath was examined and found to have formed his opinion at a distance of 20 minutes and a great many second-hand reports. 2 further witnesses, a tenant farmer who had held his lease at Asherton Park for 12 years and a retired clergyman who had known the Earl since boyhood, added their accounts. Constance spoke last. She said what she had observed. She said it plainly and in order and without sentiment, because the facts themselves, arranged in order, were the argument. Oliver's progress, the Earl's management of the estate in difficult seasons, the quality of the household, the care with which he had handled an inquiry about his son's welfare by consulting someone with no interest in the outcome. She said it plainly. "I have no interest in the outcome." She said it, and it was no longer true, and she knew it was no longer true. And she said it anyway, because it had been true when it mattered, which was the 3 months in which she had been watching and the facts had accumulated, and the truth of her observation did not become less reliable because of what had accumulated alongside it. Reginald Croft sat at the other side of the room and said nothing. He had the expression of a man who has built a structure and watched it fail to stand. Not dramatically, not with a single collapse, but in the slow subsidence of every element he had counted on, one by one, in the steady, polite language of people who simply told the truth. The outcome was not in doubt after the first hour. By the end of the second, the court had heard enough. Mr. Fitch caught her eye from across the room with the particular expression of a man in his profession who has done this many times and is never quite used to it going well. It was over by 3 o'clock. The Earl of Asherton did not speak until they were in the carriage. He sat across from her in the hired chaise and looked out at London passing in the grey December afternoon, and she sat opposite and looked at her hands, and neither of them said anything for several minutes, which was, she had come to understand, not unusual for him, and was becoming, through extended exposure, less unusual for her. Then he said that he intended to rebuild the bridge. She looked up. He was looking at the window. "I should like you to have an opinion about its placement," he said. She understood what this was. She understood it in the way she had come to understand things at Asherton Park, first in her hands, and then in her chest, and then as a thought fully formed and available. She said, "I think the original placement was badly situated." He turned from the window. The controlled quiet was present, as it always was, and underneath it, visible now to anyone who had been watching for 3 months and a week, was the thing it had been containing. "The stone piers are sound," he said. "It would be wasteful to start entirely from the beginning." "The piers can be used," she said. "The placement of the span could be reconsidered." "I am considering it," he said. The carriage moved through the city. Outside, the December light was thinning toward evening, and the noise of London traffic surrounded them. And inside the chaise, there was the kind of silence that is not empty, but full. The kind that holds 2 people carefully while they work out the distance between where they have been and where they are going. she said. "Oliver will want to hear what happened today." "He will hear everything," he said. "He is old enough." "He is," she agreed. "He will also want to know what happens next." He looked at her directly, which was not unusual, and with an openness that was, and she understood that the question she had half asked and he had half answered was not the question she had meant, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and they were both, in the manner of people who have spent time in the same house for months and have learned each other's rhythms without entirely meaning to, comfortable with the work of getting from here to there without rushing. "I should like," he said carefully, "to speak to Mr. Fitch." She said, "About the bridge?" He said, "About a great many things." She looked at her hands. She thought of Oliver asking questions in the schoolroom. She thought of the corridor in October, and the expression she had not been able to name then, which she could name now, which was the expression of a man who understood that something he loved could be taken from him and had no idea how to prevent it, and was trying to prevent it anyway by the only means available, which was to stand at the door and listen. He would not be taken from. She was no longer passing through. The December light outside the carriage windows had gone to dusk by the time they left London behind. The road home ran through countryside that was dark and cold and entirely ordinary, hedgerows and stone walls and the occasional lit window of a farmhouse passing in the dark. None of it notable, all of it real. The unhurried particular world that continues its business regardless of what has been decided in the rooms of cities. She watched it pass. He watched it pass. They did not speak, and the silence inside the chaise was the good kind, the quiet of two people who do not need to fill the space between them because the space has already been decided, and who are, perhaps for the first time in a long while, in no hurry to arrive anywhere other than where they are. They arrived at Asherton Park at 9 o'clock at night. The house was lit. Mrs. Drummond had waited up. Oliver had been asleep for an hour, according to the nursery maid, but had left instructions through her that he was to be told as soon as someone returned. The Earl went upstairs to wake his son and tell him. Constance stood in the entrance hall and looked at the house around her, the stone floors and the high ceiling and the candlelight moving in the draught from the opened door. The house looked, she thought, like itself, like what it was, which was a house that someone was keeping. She was the one keeping it. She had been, without quite deciding to, for 3 months. She had been keeping it in the way that one keeps a thing that needs keeping. Steadily and quietly, and without announcement, in the accumulated daily work of being present. The hired cart was not waiting. The small trunk was upstairs in the governess's room, where it had been unpacked since September. Mrs. Drummond appeared at the far end of the hall. She looked at Constance for a moment with the expression of a woman recalculating. The housekeeper had been at Asherton Park for 20 years. She had, in those 20 years, seen many women pass through this house, and she had formed her views of them quickly and revised them rarely, and the views she had revised she did not speak about. She had observed them with the clear, practical eye of someone responsible for the household's working, and she had reached her conclusions quietly and had not, in Constance's experience, been wrong. "Well," she said at last. She said it in a tone that meant a great deal more than the word itself. And then she went back to wherever she had come from, and the entrance hall was quiet again. Overhead, through the ceiling, Constance could hear Oliver's voice, bright and carrying, asking his father questions. She could not hear the Earl's replies. She could hear the quality of them, low and steady and patient. The specific sound of someone answering everything. She stood in the entrance hall and listened to them for a moment, Then she went to the library, because the library fire would need attention, and because it was, she had decided, her library now, in the way that the house was her house, and the morning was her morning, and the bridge, when it was rebuilt in the spring, would occupy its new placement on the piers that remained, and she would have argued for and been heard. Which was the thing she had not known she was missing until she had arrived at Asherton Park as a woman the house would not keep, and found that she was wrong. She brought up the fire. She settled in the wing chair. The letter from Margaret was not on the table beside it. He had taken it upstairs. In its place was a small object she had not noticed in the darkness of the night before. A folded program from a concert in Bath, dated 1809, with a note in a different hand along the margin. The note said, in faded ink, that the second movement was too slow, and they had argued about it all the way home, and she had been right, and she had won, and it had been one of the better evenings of the year. Constance looked at it for a moment. Then she put it carefully aside and sat in the firelight and listened to the house settle around her into the particular quiet of a December night. The cold outside and the warmth within. The sound of a child's voice going gradually to stillness as sleep came for him, and the sound of a man's footsteps on the stairs, measured and deliberate, descending toward where she was. She did not move. The fire spoke. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall across the park, and across the stone piers at the river, and across the black-burned planking that still lay in the water, waiting, patient as stone, to be made into something new. Thank you for staying until the end. If Constance's journey moved you, leave a word in the comments, and return when you are ready for the next story.